Hey, it's Guy Raz here, and welcome to The Great Creators. This is where I have conversations with some of the most incredible artists, musicians, and actors of our time. Today on the show, legendary 13-time Grammy Award winner, T-Bone Burnett. T-Bone Burnett is one of those super producers like Quincy Jones or Rick Rubin. The list of artists he's worked with will blow your mind. People like Bob Dylan, Elvis Costello, Elton John, Counting Crows, and so many others. T-Bone's also put together some of the most memorable TV and movie soundtracks of all time. So today on the show, how T-Bone does it all and why he thinks he's doing some of the best work of his career well into his 70s. So here it is. Enjoy my conversation with 13-time Grammy winner T-Bone Burnett. I know that your wife calls you Henry or Hank, but most people call you T-Bone, right?
Yeah, my wife and my good friends called me Henry, so you can call me Henry if you want.
But T-Bone is what everybody, I mean, that's that's the name that you tell me about the name about how you got that name, because you were born Joseph Henry Burnett III.
Yeah, I was in the neighborhood in Fort Worth, Texas when I was about 6 or 7, something like that. I got the name T-Bone. I think I was called Bone because I was so skinny back in those days. And then there was another Bone, a guy called Carl Wayne
There was
Hickey.
another Bone on the block.
Just up the block, yeah. And so I became T-Bone somehow. And it's a name I tried to shake for years because just up the street in Dallas, Texas, was T-Bone Walker, who's probably one of the greatest blues guitar players, one of the greatest guitar players, period, of all time. And I didn't want to seem like like Frank Sinatra Jr. or something like that. So, but it's just one of those names one can't escape.
I mean, it's interesting because part of me, like, it's like a tough guy name. It's like right. It's like and you did have. I mean, you had a kind of maybe tough guy's not the right persona, but you I mean, as a younger man, certainly you had your moments of I don't know, sort of being a rebel and sort of having that reputation. But were you I mean, did you live up to that? I mean, as a kid, were you quiet? Were you rebellious? Like, what do you remember about just being you as a kid?
Well, I was both those things. Yeah, I was both quiet and rebellious, and I can tell you that 40, 50 years in the record business put a pretty hard edge on me. So
yeah. I
had early on in my life, I was very disappointed. They start telling you lies just from the very beginning. They start telling you about Santa Claus and all that stuff, and so yeah, I have to admit now, as I look back on it, because things have changed quite a lot for me. But as I look back, I was cynical. People always said my writing was cynical, and I always resisted that characterization of my writing because I thought it was more. I thought it was heartfelt. I thought I was fighting for. Well, I thought, and I still think I was fighting for the human race. In the face of a technological onslaught that wanted to turn us into cyborgs, et cetera.
T-Bone, I know that you grew up in Fort Worth, as you mentioned, mainly in the 50s and early 60s.
Right.
And tell me a little bit about how you were exposed to instruments. I know that at home you guys had a Cole Porter, and your parents had a record player, and you would listen to Louis Armstrong. How did that, and also you grew up at a time, really the birth of rock and roll. Right? I mean, this is like the 50s, early 60s. Like, this is when it's all coming out. Did you connect with rock and roll right away? Do you remember as a kid?
I did, yeah. I connected. I felt a lot of the same feelings. Fort Worth at the time was very much a part of the military-industrial complex. So there were B-52s. Well, General Dynamics was there, and Carswell Air Force Base was there. And there were B-52s taking off and circling the town all day long. And it gave the town a low ceiling. It seemed like it seemed like the only futures were to either go to work at General Dynamics or into the oil business or something like that. And neither of those were interesting, but I remember hearing Jerry Lee Lewis when I was probably, 9, something like that.
On the radio, just playing on the radio.
Yeah, just hearing on the radio and then getting the record and rolling around on the floor laughing at a whole lot of shaking going on.
Laughing because it was just like mind-blowing, like that.
Yeah, it was like music from another planet or something. It was freedom. And, years later, I recorded a guy called the legendary Stardust Cowboy, which was a very similar explosion of just unbridled energy. There were obvious differences between the two, but there was something about them that had the same sense.
Were your parents, I know that your grandfather, I think, was like the secretary of the Southern Baptist Convention. And I saw, were your parents open to you listening to Jerry Lee Lewis and early rock and roll?
Yeah, they were. They weren't around that much anyway. They were both working. I was sort of left to my own devices. But Buddy Holly was very much the avatar of that time for me, and I don't think anyone found anything very objectionable about Buddy Holly. He was just flat good. He could sing, he could play, he could write. He recorded his own records. He became the prototype, really, for everybody who came after him.
What about Elvis?
Yeah, I never got into Elvis. I thought he was funny. I saw him I remember him being on television and they blacked out the bottom half of the screen or something so you couldn't see his knees knocking together or whatever it was, rubber legging, So there was something scandalous about Elvis that I didn't really understand, or I didn't get it. I got Jerry Lee, but I didn't get Elvis.
T-Bone, tell me how a kid, because you were a really talented golfer. You played golf in college, and you're still, I think, a pretty talented golfer. How does a kid who's really good at golfing, tell me how you decided to pick up an instrument one day. How did that happen?
It's funny. I was at a golf tournament, and, my aunt, whom I spent a great deal of time with, played piano, and she had an accordion. And so my first instrument was really accordion, which is interesting because it has the buttons with the left hand that plays chords, and then you can sort of figure out a melody with the right hand. So I got into music that way, just feeling my way through it. But the guitar in particular, which is the thing I fell in love with, there was a beautiful little Gibson guitar leaning against the wall of a house I was staying in Wichita Falls, Texas, during a junior golf tournament called the Texas-Oklahoma Junior. And I went over and I remember hitting the E string of the guitar, wondering what it was, and it made a sound that I've been chasing ever since.
Wow.
Yeah, it was there was this powerful resonance. And, music is interesting. Every note you hit on a piano has every other note in the piano in it at some volume. So you hit a note, and that note itself is a sine wave. It's a pure, simple wave, but it sets off all these overtones that create an overtone pattern or structure. And then when you hit this note and then you hit this note, those two overtone pattern structures begin to speak to each other, begin a dance of their own. And that's the world I got interested in. And that's what the guitar had, that box that had that resonating chamber that set off this incredibly complex tone.
How do you, so that, you mentioned like rolling on the floor, laughing just with joy, listening to Jerry Lee Lewis. And so there's something about that music that spoke to you viscerally. And then you mentioned this E string on the guitar, which is not like a lot of kids at age 12 strum a guitar, see a guitar somewhere, and then they move on, right? But there's something about that experience that was a step further for you. You wanted to learn how to play it, and not just learn how to play it, but to become good at it.
Yeah, and I wanted to find out what that mystical experience was of hearing sound other than just the thing you're just the thing you're touching.
Yeah. What explains that? I mean, what explains that in a 12-year-old?
I have no idea. I can't explain it, but I'm glad. I'm grateful for the experience. I can say that it's led me to a long life in music. So there was something prophetic about it in my life. So that's something I can't explain.
I read that your mom bought you an inexpensive acoustic guitar from Mexico.
Right.
And when you got that guitar, I mean, was it you just couldn't put it down? You just were always in your room?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, I was always in my room anyway, but then I had a friend to be in my room with.
Yeah.
I was an only child.
Yeah.
My parents both worked, so I would come home from school and we would, play out in the yard for a little while or something. Then I would have a few hours to myself, and that's how I filled those hours.
I think one of your friends as a kid was Stephen Bruton, who you would go on to have a long lot of collaborations with. He, of course, is no longer alive, but also a remarkable career as a musician. Tell me about just, going from loving the sound of the E string, learning how to play the guitar, and then wanting to be in a band and making music. Was it the kind of thing where you would listen to rock and roll, or you'd see rock and roll stars on television, you thought, I want to do that?
No, I didn't think of being a rock and roll star. That never occurred to me as a potential life path, But what did I got a job when Stephen and I were both about 14. We happened to get jobs at the same time at T.H. Kahn Music Store in Fort Worth, Texas. And I was refinishing guitars and occasionally giving a guitar lesson, which I barely knew how to play myself, but they would book me out for those kind of things. And Stephen was working there as well. And he was one of the most charming, maybe the funniest cat I ever met in my life. And we struck a deep, long-lasting friendship. And it just seemed natural because we both loved the guitar and both played music to play together. So he was playing in a bluegrass band called the Brazos River Ramblers. I guess you'd call them a bluegrass band now. It wasn't actually called bluegrass at the time. It was just called mountain music or country music. We were listening. His dad owned a record shop called Record Town.
His dad was a jazz professor, drummer, right?
Yeah, jazz drummer, very good jazz drummer.
Yeah,
and we would order records from Smithsonian or Smithsonian and all of those that odd collection of.
We'd call you a music nerd today.
Yeah, I guess I would be. Yeah. I guess we both were, and I liked, but it was more than music. It was atmosphere. It was a lot of stuff. Doc Boggs, when you would hear Doc Boggs back in those days, it was like hearing somebody from another century, another planet. Even though it had been recorded only a few years before, it seemed out of time. And Clarence Ashley, there were a lot of these cats that were extraordinary musicians, but had no touch to the popular culture at all. They were just doing it in their homes, wherever they were. And it was a fascinating glimpse into another world, and it was a dream world. And I think entering those dream worlds that those people conjured was a lot of what led me forward.
So you did go to start at college at Texas Christian University, but you dropped out to pursue music. So, I mean, at a certain point when you were there, you decided that this is really what you wanted to do, that you wanted to see if you could make a go at it.
Yeah, well, we went in, I was in a high school band, and to get gigs, we went into the studio to make a record. And it turned out that the studio was for sale. And the engineer, who was a guy named Phil York, who went on to engineer Red-Headed Stranger for Willie Nelson and a lot of other stuff. He's a very good engineer. said, "Well, why don't you buy it?" And I thought, "Well, that's a crazy idea." And a couple of friends of mine and I bought it. A guy named Jim Rutledge, who was the drummer for a band called Blood Rock later, who had a hit called DOA or something like that had a siren in it and got banned from the radio because of the siren, but it became a hit nevertheless. So we bought this studio, and I started working there and managing it, and it left me no time to go to school.
Tell me about, I'm just thinking about that as a business decision, right? Like a studio, first of all, how did you have the cash to buy it?
Well, we went to the bank. The three of us went to the bank and borrowed it, talked the banker into giving us the money.
Wow.
It wasn't that much money. It wasn't the kind of money that a studio got to be later,
Right.
Although I will say, as I remember, all of the equipment we bought was $20,000. Today, that equipment would be worth, $1 million
right.
or something like that.
And in Fort Worth, right? I'm sure there was a scene there, but was there a community of recording artists to support a studio?
Yeah, yes and no. There was a place called Panther Hall that had country acts coming through every weekend. So Conway Twitty would come through, or Doug Kershaw, or people like that would come through and play a show at Panther Hall, and then at at 1 a.m. when they were cleared out, they would want to go do something. So they would show up at the studio with a bottle of Crown Royal and a couple of Snuff Queens, and we would stay up all night recording hillbilly music.
Wow.
And there was also a teenage music scene because, the Beatles had just happened.
Yeah. We're talking about 65, 66 now.
65, yeah.
Yeah.
And, the Beatles were the first rock and roll band. They were the prototype. Before the Beatles, all rock and roll was performed by a singer with sidemen. So there would be a front man and 3 sidemen. The Beatles were 4 front men. And that really opened up, that fact opened up the idea of being a rock and roll band to my whole generation.
So, all right, so you've got this production studio, you got the studio in Fort Worth, but you mentioned something earlier, which is, Fort Worth was a military town, and, the B-2s or B-52s were produced there. And you said something that struck me. You said there was a low ceiling in Fort Worth. Literally, not literally, every ceiling is a sky, but you felt that it was a low ceiling, that it was a place. It sounds like from the time you were a kid and maybe a teenager and really getting into music, you knew that you wanted to get out of there.
I got out of there the first second I could. Yeah, it was. There's a great scene in The Last Picture Show, which was filmed just up the street from Fort Worth in Archer City, Texas. Yeah. And Ben Johnson and Timothy Bottoms, I think it was, are sitting out on a tank, one of those old tanks in Texas with, mud on the bank with hoof prints in it. And the mud was gray, and the tank was gray, and there was a little thin row of mesquite trees on the other row of the other side of the tank, and then the sky was gray and the clouds were gray. And Ben Johnson looks around and goes, "Isn't this beautiful?" And I felt that you found beauty in it when you were there, and there is something beautiful. Also, art. Fort Worth had a really powerful art scene and good museums, and it supported music and supported the arts to a degree, but it felt like the only hits that ever came out of North Texas at that time, there was one big hit by Bruce Chanel called "Hey Baby." Mm-hmm. And then there were a couple. J. Frank Wilson, I think it was, had a song called "Last Kiss" about a guy dying in a car wreck. And but it all seemed sort of like novelties. That there wasn't a thriving recording scene.
Yeah.
And all of the stuff I loved seemed to be coming out of either London or Los Angeles, with a little bit out of New York. But Los Angeles at the time was a mecca for what was at that time called the record business.
Yeah, and of course, it still is to some extent. But it's interesting because when you started in it, it was a lot more dispersed. Like there was a scene in Memphis, and there was a scene in New Orleans, and there was a scene in Chicago. And so you could, I mean, there was a world where you could create like a sustainable business doing that, but clearly you wanted to move out to L.A.
But each one of those scenes had a patron, so to speak,
right,
who was able to marshal the resources in that city. But it was still very much a cottage industry in the city. It wasn't the kind of powerful scene that there was in Los Angeles or New York. Detroit had Motown, which was Berry Gordy and his group of extraordinary musicians and singers, and he had the vision to put it all together into what became an important label. Memphis had Jim Stewart. New Orleans had Alan Toussaint and Marshall Sehorn.
Yeah.
So they were all they were all created by and around a person or a couple of people. Fort Worth didn't have that.
Did you see yourself primarily as a guitarist, a singer, or a producer, or all of those things?
I saw myself primarily as a producer and a songwriter. As I loved the idea of independent producer. I remember when I did leave Texas Christian University, I told my dad I decided to become an independent record producer, and he said, "What's that?"
Yeah,
nobody
question.
Knew. Yeah, it was a good question. But nobody knew, including me. I didn't know what it was either. I knew Phil Spector was one, and that was about all I knew about it.
Yeah.
But I thought, what I knew of corporations was General Dynamics. That was the corporation in town. Also, by the way, a strategic air command base was in Fort Worth, a SAG base, whatever they called it. So it was a mystery life to choose, but I thought it was a way to get out of town and to get into those worlds where it seemed to be all this music seemed to be generated and all this collaboration was taking place.
It's interesting because so many people, and we've had people on the show who have similar stories. They go out to Los Angeles, some in the 60s, some in the 70s, 80s. And in virtually every case, it's to go and become a star. And your model wasn't the pop singers. It was Burt Bacharach. You wanted to kind of be him.
Yeah, it was. Well, I just thought I wasn't comfortable performing. I never thought of myself as a performer, nor did I want to be a performer. But I wanted a creative life. And I loved the idea that Burt Bacharach had Dionne Warwick, and he had this great singer before her, he had Marlene Dietrich, and he would write. And before Dionne Warwick, he also had a cat named Lou Johnson, who was extraordinary. He played organ over in a club in Dallas called the Green Parrot. And we'd go over and see him. He was a terrible junkie, I'm sure he's gone now. At the time, he was playing organ and kicking bass on the bass pedals with a drummer, and it was a completely exciting band. Those two guys, they were killing it. But that's a sidetrack. I thought Bacharach has this. He gets to write this beautiful music. He gets to arrange it, record it. And he has a singer go out and sing it for him. He doesn't have to go do it. Harlan Howard said once, he said, "Son, you can either write 10 songs and get a bus and get a truck and get a band and a manager and a PA system. You can go out on the road and promote those 10 songs, or you can write 10 songs and get 10 guys with 10 buses and 10 PA systems." And I thought, there's wisdom in that,
Yeah. Thinking about people like Burt Bacharach and Phil Spector and then you at that time, it's sort of like these like proto sort of super producers, right? Like you think about today, big DJs, this started in the early 2000s, like David Guetta or Calvin Harris. And all of a sudden, they went from just being guys who spun music to, DJ David Guetta featuring Rihanna or featuring, Beyonce. And that really changed. And that Burt Bacharach was basically a version of that. He was the guy that kind of created that idea.
Well, that's right. The turntable just became another musical instrument at some point. So those guys they're creators and producers,
Yeah. So you came out to L.A. and how did you break in? I mean, here you are, you're an unknown guy from Fort Worth, right? And probably, people had this perception of you being like maybe like a hillbilly or a hick in L.A. You know how people in L.A. are?
Well, the first day I got to Los Angeles, I went out with a friend named Charlie Carey, who had been out there before. He was a rockabilly singer in the 50s in Fort Worth. And we went out there and we went to a place in the San Fernando Valley that they called the Plantation. Mm-hmm. And it was a house. It was maybe an acre or two lot with 2 or 3 houses on it. And there was a jam session going on in that house, and it went on every day. It was all musicians lived in the house, not quite communally, but it was shared. We're roommates in this place. And I walked in, and the first people I met were Taj Mahal.
Wow.
And Bonnie and Delaney, and Jesse Ed Davis. Chuck Blackwell was playing drums. Carl Radel was playing bass. And there was an extraordinary scene, mostly from Tulsa, Oklahoma, but also some cats from Texas, and we all liked the same stuff. And there was I owe a lot to Charlie for taking me out and introducing me to those people, because it did give me a way to enter the culture out there.
And that's sort of essentially over time you would meet people and did you would people ask you to like be a session musician for them, or would they say sure, come produce my music? Like how tell me how that started.
Well, at the time I was trying to write songs for people. But occasionally I would get a call to play. I played piano on a few sessions. I played guitar on some sessions. There was a wonderful songwriter, producer named Daniel Moore, who wrote some hits back in those days, one called Shambhala and one called My Maria for B.W. Stevenson, I think it was. And he was very generous with me and would bring me in to play sessions. He would, feed me when I was, I was like, I was living somewhat on the benevolence of other people at the time.
I just reading about, we're not going to be able to get to all the details of your life because all the people you've worked with, it's overwhelming as just somebody who's read and researched your life. But I think about, especially this time in your life, you're almost like what we'd call you think of like an AI today, just like absorbing information and then becoming this thing, right? You're hanging out with Janis Joplin, or like Albert Grossman, who worked with Janis Joplin, and then you're meeting like Sam Shepard, and like the playwright, and then you're meeting Taj Mahal, and then Bob Dylan. Like there are all these different influences that are coming into your world, and I wonder if you're able to kind of articulate how that started to shape what the music that you made, that you wanted to create.
Well, first of all, the only way anyone ever remembers you is by your work. So I did good work. I tried to do good work, and I tried to pay attention to what was good. And when I would see a good drummer like Jim Keltner, became a friend in probably 1967 or something like that, who went on to work with Dylan and John Lennon and George Harrison, and he's still playing, he's still great, and I'm working with Ringo Starr right now, and Ringo says that Keltner's his idol, And so, I'll tell you what I think it was mostly. I always wanted to be the worst guy in every band I was in. because I would constantly be, people make you raise your game.
Yeah. I see what you mean by that. You didn't want to obviously be the worst, but you wanted everybody else to be better than you so you could actually learn from them.
Yeah, that's right. So I was open to learning always. I have to say, I didn't know anything when I got out there. When I got out to Los Angeles, it was all dark to me.
I mean, you went on tour with Bob Dylan. I mean, you played with Joni Mitchell and Gordon Lightfoot. I mean, this is just the beginning of your career at that time. And tell me what you remember about because that's a big deal, right? I mean, that was a Rolling Thunder Revue, and there you are a performer. There you're on stage with Bob Dylan. How did you learn how to become a performer?
I think if I, at the risk of sounding any more pretentious than I am anyway.
No, you're not at all.
I think I was very uncomfortable performing, and I think Bob knew that. Bob has an extraordinary eye for latent talent. And on the second Rolling Thunder tour, he started pushing me out to the front because I was hanging, all the time we were doing it, I was just hanging around in the back trying to be invisible. And I had a 7-minute song called Sashiko, or Silver Mantis. I played it on the piano. And he's about 2/3, 3/4 of the way through his set, he would take off his guitar and put on a bass and introduce me in this song. And he made me play this song in the middle of this extraordinary intensity he had built up over the period of an hour or two. And I would have to absorb that attention and that intensity. And that was the greatest lesson I ever had in performing, because I felt some of what he feels when he's playing. But Bobby Newirth, there's a cat named Bobby Newirth. Are you familiar with him?
Yeah, but for people who don't know about him, tell us about him.
Well, Newirth was part of the Cambridge folk music boom, or scare, as Martin Mull called it, in the late 50s, early 60s, and became a confidant and a friend of Dylan early on. He's in Don't Look Back. He was sort of Bob's Man Friday the 13th,
Yeah.
And he was with Janis Joplin, he was with Jim Morrison, he was with Chris Christopherson. He wrote "Lord, Won't You Buy Me a Mercedes-Benz?"
Wow, right.
And he was an extraordinary painter and songwriter, a great, great songwriter. And there were about 2 or 3 years where he was living up in Coldwater Canyon, just about 2 houses up from Burt Bacharach and Angie Dickinson. On Lime Orchard was the name of the street. And every night we would go down to the Troubadour, and at the end of the night we would take whoever was at the Troubadour back up to the house, and we would play music. We would sit around in the living room and play music for hours. And it would be Warren Zevon and Donnie Everly and Willie Nelson, or Roger Miller, a wild array of these extraordinary, mostly songwriters. And we would always throw songs back and forth. And Newirth was the first one to really push me out. He would say, "Play your new song," and he would encourage me. And I was petrified at the idea of playing a song in front of Donnie Everly.
Yeah.
It seemed so far removed from Donnie Everly to me growing up. I mean, when did they start? 57, 56, 57, something like that. All those songs, like Bird Dog was the national anthem for me in grade school, So he put you on the spot. Newirth would always, just as Dylan put me on the spot, Newirth would put me on the spot in a smaller scale, but I learned what I know about performing, and probably in that living room
by being pushed out of your comfort zone,
way out of my comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm a listener. I've been a listener my whole life. I love listening, and I don't like really being listened to. It must be some kind of psychopathy or something, if that's a word.
Yeah, I mean, imagine, you're listening to the Everly Brothers as a kid, and then like 10 years later, you find yourself in a living room playing for Don Everly.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been thrilling and terrifying, but by being pushed to do that, you just had to do it, and probably everybody in the room, nobody was like, "Oh, that sucked."
No, we would. It was always pretty good. You know, the songs were good. Yeah. I wasn't a good performer. That's a public performance is a gift that I wasn't given. I mean, I got to the point where I could do it pretty well, but I also had a mentor, a guy named Johnny Stroud, who was an interesting cat. He graduated from Stanford at 17, magna cum laude, and
wow.
He was asked to work on the Manhattan Project and declined for moral reasons, and wrote the program for the space station as a response to the nuclear bomb. And when I met him, he was a systems analyst at the RAND think tank at Point Mugu in California. And one of my close friends from high school had married his daughter. So we would go up to his house and sit at his feet for hours on end while he would mentor us, really. He would tell us stories. He would tell us how science worked. He would tell us all, he had broad knowledge. But he was very down on public performers. And he would say, public performance is not it was probably like my grandfather would have been that way, the Southern Baptist grandfather would have thought, no, don't put your name up on that marquee. What are you, crazy?
There have been a few times in your career where and I'll ask you about it another time later, but you have kind of left music or dropped out for some time. And I think probably with good reason and probably was helpful. But I think in the late 70s, you left LA, went back to Texas, and you stopped making music for some time. You started working on a novel.
Yeah, I started writing a book, and I'm still, it's funny, that book has taken many different forms, but it was a way to try to, I've told this story before in this last couple of weeks, but when I was maybe 12 or 13, I learned about Ivan Pavlov and his experiments with dogs and bells and all of that, and the implications of that were immediately clear to me, that the experiments he was doing in 1905 in Russia were being done in 1955 in Fort Worth, Texas. That those experiments in behavioral modification were being run on our whole culture, and it was being done electronically now. We were being conditioned electronically to behave a certain way to try to keep us in line. I think that was a great deal of the attraction of rock and roll. It was a breakdown of the programming, the electronic programming. It was somebody using the electronic programming to break the machine. And almost all of my work, in fact, was written about that subject. And Johnny Stroud, the man I was talking about a minute ago, was very knowledgeable about all that. But after I learned about Pavlov for years as a teenager, I had a dream that we were all lined up around the parish hall, the walls of the parish hall of my Episcopal church. And there were some shadow men down in the far corner that were cutting off everyone's right hand and replacing it with an electronic hand that would become their control mechanism. And I would wake up, I was already playing guitar at that time, so I would wake up in a cold sweat, in my dream screaming, "They can't take my hand, I got to get out of here," And it became the main focus of my work, resisting that, trying to warn other people about it, because I saw it coming so clearly. Not only did I, but Aldous Huxley certainly did, who I got into soon after that. Marshall McLuhan, Jacques Ellul, who was a great French sociologist, wrote about this. Neil Postman. Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon. There was a lot of art and thought that were talking about this same thing. So it wasn't like I was a seer or anything. It was just it was something that landed on me, but it was an obsession. So I decided to write a book about it. It was called, and I'm still working. I'm still working on the story. It's taken many different forms. I've started the book about 3 times and thrown it away because I would get too depressed, really. But I started years later, probably in the early part of this century. I walked into a Starbucks one day, or into a coffee shop, and everybody in the coffee shop was looking at his phone. And I realized, they didn't have to cut our hands off. They just put it in our hands. And at that point, I thought, okay, now we're here. We're here at this place I've been dreading my whole life. So it's time to wrap this up, whatever this is. I want to stop writing about it. I want to stop living within it. I want to stop fighting it. I want to move past it. I want to move through it. And so I realized there's an interesting book by Ian McGilchrist called The Master and His Emissary. And in it, he posits that human beings sang to each other like dolphins or whales for thousands of years before we innovated the technology of language. And the implications of that were immediately clear to me, that we innovated language so that we could lie to each other, because when we sang to each other, it was all pure tone and everybody knew what everyone else was saying. So in order to be able to keep secrets, we invented language. And that was the beginning of my escape from the dystopia, because I realized, I've been a listener my whole life. This is what I am. I'm a listener, and I hear tone. And so I can escape this dystopia through listening and hearing tone. And when I did that, I escaped the dystopia. That's when all these songs on this record came rushing into me, because they were all in a new tone. They were all about something new for me. It was something different.
I'm curious about, you of course eventually did get back into music after that brief interregnum, but I'm curious about, because we won't be able to talk about all of your just incredibly prolific life and the people you've worked with, but I'm curious about faith, about Christianity in particular, because I know it's informed some of your music, and I don't know what your relationship is with your faith now or today, but at times in your life and career, it has influenced what you write about, right?
Yeah, I think it's always influenced what I write about, and it still does. Maybe more so now than ever, because I've been freed from the bonds of having to be some kind of savior myself, or whatever I viewed my responsibility as a person of faith. It's all broken down for me. I mean, but I'm filled with belief. I would say that. That's why when we started, I was talking about how disappointed I was because they lied to me about Santa Claus, because I believed them.
You believe.
They made me a sucker, and it angered me. I'm still angry about it. Not really, but yeah, I think, first of all, I think life is a religious question. I don't really believe there are religious answers. I don't believe there's one religious answer that covers all of life. But I do believe life's important, I guess is the simple way to say it, and we should encourage life and be grateful for it.
Do you think it's a bit of a cliche, right, that as we get older, many oftentimes we become closer to the faith we might have rejected as children or as teenagers or as young adults? But I wonder, in your case, is that true? Do you feel? I mean,
No, I don't. No, I don't feel closer to that. I feel like I know something about it, which I didn't know. I've learned a lot. I mean, certainly nowadays you see what's going on in the what they would call the right-wing Christian nationalists. I never understood Nazi Germany, which was a lot of people in Germany at that time viewed their movement as a Christian movement, and I could never understand that. I understand it now. I mean, it's clear now in our culture. So I know more about it, but I also embrace Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and the complexities of life much more openly. I'm much more there. I welcome the complexities rather than trying to boil it all down to a scripture or something like that.
Tell me a little bit about your work. I want to ask you about a few particular projects that you worked on. Particularly, I want to ask you about Los Lobos' legendary record that came out, I think, in '84, right? How will the wolf survive? Or How Will the Wolf Survive? The song was "Will the Wolf Survive?"
Right.
This was a mega record in 1984, considered one of the best records of the year, and won Grammys and all kinds of things. But it was not an easy project that you got involved with.
I don't remember it as not being easy. I remember the extraordinary. I remember a lot of beautiful times with those cats, and David Hidalgo is certainly one of the best musicians I've ever gotten to work with, and they're all soulful cats, and it was an interesting time because there was the punk rock scene in Hollywood at the time, and they had come out of playing basically norteño music and cumbias and things like that. They were an acoustic folk band that picked up electric instruments, and I'm sure even before that. I mean, David Hidalgo's a great blues guitar player, and I viewed a lot of the soul music as coming out of the people from south of whose lineage was from south of the Rio Grande River. But so I thought they were an important band, and they killed. He's a great singer. Caesar's a great singer. Conrad Lozano is a beautiful cat. They're wonderful guys, and I really enjoyed the collaboration.
How do you? I mean, whether it's Los Lobos or Robert Plant, and anybody, any of these folks you've worked with, Katie Lang, Tony Bennett, how do you, when you're in the studio, how do you start to pull things out of people? I mean, there's famous, and I don't know if it really is what he did, but Brian Eno had that deck of cards, that people would play around with, and they would say, okay, everybody switch around. Now you're the drummer, you're the guitarist. What are some things that you have done in the studio to get people to really reach into their authenticity?
Well, there have been times, you can do simple things like the thing you're talking about with Eno, where you make everybody play through one amplifier, for instance.
Right.
So instead of everybody being on separate walled-off amplifiers, listening to themselves on headphones, everybody has to listen to everybody. So overall, the technique I use is to put everybody in a room where everybody can hear each other, and walk around until I can hear everybody, and then listen really hard. So much of playing music is listening. 90% of playing is listening, and producing records is the same.
I mean, just the range, variety of people that you've produced. I mentioned Robert Plant, Alison Krauss, Diana Krall, Elton John, the Corrs, the Counting Crows, Jacob Dylan. I mean, that was a massive record that came out in '94. Jacob Dylan's record. But you really, Randy Carlile, I can go on and on. But it's interesting because you are largely known for the film soundtracks, particularly the Coen Brothers work.
Well, the Coen Brothers has been the most rewarding collaboration of my life, I have to say.
How did that happen? I mean, obviously, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is just incredible film, in large part because the music in that film, which is your work. How did that come about?
Well, we had worked on The Big Lebowski together.
Yeah.
It was their first soundtrack movie. And I was working with, I'll sound like a terrible name dropper, but this has just been my life. So I'm just going to say what happened. I was working with Sam Shepard on a play called Tooth of Crime in downtown New York. And he had a play opening on Broadway. His first play ever to be on Broadway was called Buried Child. And he and I went up to the premiere, the premiere, I guess, what they call it on Broadway? I don't know. But Sam and I went up, and as we were walking in, Fran McDormand and Joel Coen were there. They had just gotten their tickets, and they were walking in, so we walked in together, and Joel said, T-Bone, we're making a soundtrack movie, and would you like to do it? And I said, absolutely. When? How soon can we start? Because I loved their movie Blood Simple. It was shot in Texas.
Such a good movie.
Such a beautiful movie.
So good.
It was shot in Texas, and some friends I'd grown up with were on the crew, so it felt very much like a home movie. And then I had watched Raising Arizona maybe 30 times.
What an amazing film.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Those guys are just as good as it gets. And so I was thrilled to even be considered to do something with them. In Raising Arizona, I loved the way they took Ode to Joy and used the Pete Seeger arrangement of it with whistling and banjo and all of that.
Yeah.
And another friend of mine, John Crowder, had performed that for the film. And so we started that film, and we had a great time. And I sent one of the songs them for the dude because he was an epic hero. I sent him the song. I sent them the song "Man of Constant Sorrow," and they didn't want that for the dude. But when we got into the next film we did together, which was "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," it was a natural fit for that epic hero, the Ulysses character, Ulysses McGill, I believe his name
And
was.
that's a famous scene when they're recording that song in the studio with that microphone, that drop-down mic.
Yeah.
John Turturro, and it's so good.
Yeah, I love I'll always love that movie and that whole experience. I'll always be grateful to Clooney for being so generous as to, basically, you could say on one hand, he starred in a music video for all this hillbilly music.
By the way, I still to this day cannot hear the Eagles without thinking of the dude talking about how much he hates the Eagles.
Well, that was a lot of people hated the Eagles back in those days.
So funny. And you've had this partnership with them you did Lady Killers inside Llewellyn Davis. It's how do you think about, particularly with films, how do you think about the role of the music? The music in those films, particularly Llewellyn Davis or Oh Brother, it's so important. It's without the music, there's no movie. It's a key part of it. It's right. It's what you go see the movie for, in addition to seeing the story.
Yeah, it's a character in the movie.
Yeah, it's a character, right? Thank you.
And I don't know how I approach it exactly. There's one thing I believe before everything else is if you're putting music in a movie or a television show, it has to be great. We don't need to put any bad music into the culture. So even if the script says the song is bad, it has to be a great bad song. It has to be a bad song that's funny or smart or something, But it has to have something to so that it can stand on its own as a song.
I'm curious. I've seen you perform. I've seen you sing. You have a beautiful, beautiful voice. And do you mainly, I don't know, when you think about yourself and what you do you think of yourself as a singer, songwriter? Do you think of yourself as a producer and arranger, somebody who elevates other people's work, or all of those things?
No, I think of myself as a producer and a songwriter, I would say, primarily,
Not as a singer.
No, I don't think of myself as a singer, although I'm beginning to get a bit of objectivity about my singing at this late stage of the game.
In your 70s, which is great.
Yeah,
Good.
Better late than never, as they say.
Why do you think it took so long?
Because, I just never... I respected the singers I respected so much, and I knew I couldn't sing it. I still can't. I can't. I loved, for instance, Ray Charles. I knew I would never be able to sing as well as Ray Charles. I loved Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters, those cats, and I knew they were singing at a depth that I couldn't achieve. And Billie Holiday, and I think because I could hear, I didn't think of myself as a singer because I could hear myself sing, and I knew it wasn't as good as Billie Holiday. Although I think I'm getting there a little bit. Although I think, like on this new record, sometimes I wonder, feels like it has a bit of Billie Holiday about it to me.
Yeah, tell me about your process, right? Because I think this is, I may be wrong, but by my count, your 14th studio album that you've performed on,
Wow.
At least 14th.
Wow.
This new record, The Other Side. Tell me how what's your process? How do you write songs and words for your records now? How does it? Walk me through it.
For until this record, every song I wrote was in some way informed by this dystopia that we're living in now, this electronic dystopia. For this record, I started writing songs for other people. I was at a poetry reading, and Ringo Starr was there, and we ran into each other, and he said, "Why don't you write me a song?" And I thought, yeah, I said, I absolutely will, immediately. And thinking about Ringo, I remembered that his name is Ringo Starr because he wanted to be a cowboy singer when he was young. And I knew that he had written the Houston Chamber of Commerce and asked for Lightnin' Hopkins' address because he wanted to move to Houston and be near Lightnin' Hopkins. So I decided to write him a sort of Gene Autry type song, which is the song Come Back that's on this record that I think you heard me sing in Arizona some time ago. And I love that. It's a beautiful song, and it flowed really easily when I was writing for Ringo. So I thought, I'm here in Nashville. There's all this music. There are all these singers and writers. I should just start writing all the time for other people. And I did that. And as it started, songs started coming very quickly when I wasn't writing about the dystopia anymore or writing from the dystopia anymore. And in a period of a few weeks, I had a group of songs that I began recording demos of, so to speak. And as I recorded them with my friend Colin Linden, I realized this sounds like an album. They're cohesive. There's something about these that are together. So I just continue. I'm still doing it. I was writing yesterday. I'll write later today. And I'm writing with friends. I'm writing with a guy named Daniel Tashin. I don't know if you know him. I produced his first record several years ago. Now he's writing and producing Casey Musgraves, and they're making extraordinary records. I think one of their records won Album of the Year a couple of years ago. I'm writing with Molly Tuttle and a lot of younger musicians and singers, and I really enjoy it. And so this came more from that same idea that I've gotten outside of myself and that history that you're bringing up. And it's like starting a new life now, and I'm finally being something more like Burt Bacharach, where I'm writing for other people. You know?
I mean, it's so cool to be able to say, okay, here I am in my 70s, and I'm just hitting my stride.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
It's true, though. I am just hitting my stride, and I'm also working out a lot because I want to take good care of myself. So now that I'm doing this, it's a whole new life. Maybe I'll put a whole new library together.
Tell me about, I mean, you mentioned that, you would always kind of write through the prism of this dystopian perspective. You start to write for other people. You mentioned Ringo Starr. So initially the idea was I'm going to write songs for other people. What are other themes that you are exploring on this record?
I wasn't really writing to a theme. These I have to say these songs are, well, I would have to say they're inspired. They're appearing. They're appearing in my hands on the guitar. And like the song He Came Down, which is the first song on this record, Callie and I was working. This
is your wife, Callie Curry, the famous director and
screenwriter, beautiful screenwriter. Well, I was practicing guitar one morning and writing a song, and she came in and she asked me something over a cup of coffee, something about Appalachian music, I think. I don't remember exactly what the question was, but I said, well, it's like this. And I sang the first couple of lines of He Came Down. Just boom, just sang it. And she said, record that right now.
Wow.
And I said, record what? And she said, record what you just sang. So I thought, okay, what did I just sing? So I did. I put it on my phone. I recorded a couple of lines, and then I realized, oh, this is fun. I want to chase this down. I realized I was writing a mythological song about these mythological characters, and I wanted to, who else can I find to write about? Because the thing I loved most about it was the idea of He came down. What did He come down from? Did He come down from the mountain? Did He come down from heaven? Did He come down to hell? Did He come down off His high horse? Did He come down off drugs? What does that mean? He came down. Who is it?
Who is He? Is He Christ? Is He a man? Is He an angel? Right? There's all kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
Do you think, when you write, do you think in terms of story, in terms of a visual connection to the music that you're singing?
I think sometimes it happens that way, yeah. Yeah, I think there are a few songs on this record that are very much story songs, and I realized that when we got through this group of songs, that the whole thing was a story, really, a vague story or a mystical story, but a story nevertheless. And it's a story that has a happy ending, which is something that's become very important to me.
What do you do when you get stuck? When you just feel like you can't break through, you can't write something that you're happy with? Does it happen? It must happen.
I don't remember it happening. It must happen, but I probably just forget about it as quickly as possible. Maybe I go hit some golf balls or something.
Do you just work through things, and even if it's not great or perfect, you just still write it out? Or
I adopted the Leonard Cohen, Bob Dylan method, which is to overwrite. So, if you can write 50 verses to get 3 verses,
right,
and you can take the lines and you can shuffle them, and you keep playing with it. And see, that's almost like doing a puzzle or something. It's tremendous fun because you're using your brain to sort. And now I'm using technological language, but you're changing the order of things, and things appear to you, and when doing that, connections are made that you've never conceived of, but there it is. It's just happened.
Do you think that, because here you are in your 70s, so prolific, you just talked about some of the younger songwriters you're working with, and it seems to me that just having that connection and that spark is going to inevitably make you more creative, because it's like anything. The more you do it, the more creative ideas you get, right?
That's right. You're exactly right. Yes.
And do you think that I mean, I don't know, do you feel like you're, I don't know, even more creative now because you do that, because you practice it?
Yeah, yes. And I feel like I'm better. I mean, I know I'm better than I've ever been. And, every songwriter thinks the song he's just written is the best song he's ever written, and every artist thinks the album he's just made is the best album he ever made. But in something like Paul McCartney's case, it would be hard to say that because how many great albums has he made, or Bob Dylan. But in my case, I think I know, because now I'm listening to myself. I know I'm doing better work than I've done before.
Must feel pretty great.
I'm so happy, I've got to say. One of the things that happened to me in my cynicism over finding out Santa Claus was just a flat-out lie, was I never believed in happiness. There's that great line in Tender Mercies where Robert Duvall says that. He says, "I never believed in happiness." And I adopted that. I thought, I'm not going to let myself believe in happiness, because then I'll get happy and then I'll be crushed again. But now it's the only thing I really do believe in. It's the only thing. I think one makes a choice to be happy.
Yeah.
And I think that's something we have to do. We have to be happy and grateful for our lives.
It's an amazing insight, and it sounds like it took you time to get to that place.
All these many years, yeah.
T-Bone Burnett, thank you so much. It's great talking to you.
Thank you, Guy. It's a wonderful conversation. I hope we have many more.
Hey, thanks for watching my conversation with T-Bone Burnett. His new album, The Other Side, is out now. If you want to see more conversations like this one, please click the subscribe button so you never miss a new episode. And of course, we are first and foremost an audio podcast. So if you want to listen to the show, check us out on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for The Great Creators. I'm Guy Raz, and this has been The Great Creators for Built Up Productions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you back here next week.